better way to use medications. Here's what he writes. He says, our findings suggest that antipsychotic medication is not the treatment of choice, at least for certain patients, if one is interested in long-term clinical improvement. Many unmedicated while in hospital patients showed greater long-term improvement, less pathology at follow-up, fewer rehospitalizations, and better overall functioning in the community than patients who were given chlorpromazine, that's Thorazine, while in the hospital. So he's really arguing here that if we go back to the first episode, patients, at least a subgroup, would do better if they weren't put on neuroleptics. And we should delay use of those drugs. The second such study was Lauren Mosher's Soteria project. Many may have heard of Soteria. Lauren Mosher at the time was head of schizophrenia studies at the NIH. So this is the top schizophrenia doctor in the country. And he ran a study, randomized, either common, to send people into the hospital with medications, or you go to this house, this old Victorian house, which was staffed by people, actually non-professionals, but people who could just be with people in extreme states without getting freaked out. Now, he had a couple findings. He actually found that at the end of 6 weeks, psychosis had abated just as much in his patients, in the Soteria patients, as those treated with drugs in the hospital. So he even showed short-term efficacy with the Soteria project. But here are his 2-year results. At the end of 2 years, the Soteria patients had, quote, lower psychopathology scores, fewer readmissions, and better global adjustment than those treated conventionally with antipsychotics. And here's the use of medication in that group. 42% of the patients never exposed to an antipsychotic in the first 2 years, 39% only on a temporary basis, and 19% on a continual basis. So you see in his study this idea for sort of selective best use of medications. It's not one size fits all, but then again, there's a group that can do better without, and then we'll reserve the medications for those, apparently, who really need it, either for a temporary time or a smaller group permanently. And by the way, remember those data, because we're going to come back to that data in a modern outcome study. We're going to see that data show up again. The third study was done by William Carpenter. Again, the unmedicated patients had lower relapse rates at the end of 1 year. They also suffered from less depression, etc. And two things that I think are interesting from that study. It's done by William Carpenter. He's one of the big schizophrenia studies experts in the country. He interviewed the people who had gone through their schizophrenic episode without drugs afterwards, and he asked them, well, what was that like? And they informed him, quote, some of them, that it was gratifying and informative to have gone through that experience without having their feelings numbed by medications. And what Carpenter concluded at the end of that, he speculated, well, those on medications didn't have the same learning experience, and therefore perhaps are less able to cope with subsequent life stresses. Now, all I'm trying to say is here, this model of care was investigated by the NIH in the 1970s. Really what they're finding is medications may have a use, but it's not this medication for everyone use. It's really that some people would be better off if they weren't put on the medication for everyone. All right, now, best use model would have the selective use. Nevertheless, William Carpenter does raise at that time a big question. He says this: there is no question that once patients are placed on medication, they are less vulnerable to relapse if maintained on neuroleptics. But what if these patients had never been treated with drugs to begin with? We raise the possibility that antipsychotic medication may make some schizophrenic patients more vulnerable to future relapse than would be the case in the normal course of the illness. So you see why this is so profound. He's saying here, on the target symptom, maybe the drugs are causing some change in the biology of the brain that is actually making people more vulnerable to psychosis as opposed to less. And the reason this is so threatening and worrisome is, again, we have this question with drugs. They have a benefit-risk ratio. You need some benefit over here, knocking down psychosis, to account for all the risks. If we have medications that, at least in some people, are making them more vulnerable to psychosis, you're losing the benefit. You don't have a lot left on the side, right? So this is why this is so worrying. So what happened was, two researchers at McGill University came up with a biological explanation for what was happening and why there might be this increased relapse rate, etc. He went back, he says, how do drugs act on the brain? Their names were Guy Chenard and Barry Jones. they said, once you get that increase in dopamine receptors, the brain is now super sensitive to dopamine. It's extra sensitive to dopamine. And he said, now watch what happens when you withdraw the drug. You take away the brake, and you've got the accelerator down. And really the dopaminergic transmission may go out of careen out of control, so to speak. He says that's maybe the mechanism why we have so much relapse when people come off meds. And by the way, this is the old warning you always hear. It is, of course, very difficult to go off meds. And what he was saying is it's partly because of this change in the brain. But then he said, but how about also, so that's why we get a lot of the relapse. But then they said, what happens to the person long term? Well, he said, what may be happening to these dopaminergic pathways? Do they retain their function, in essence? And the reason he's asking that, he's saying because they're starting to see a lot of tardive dyskinesia. So what is tardive dyskinesia? There's a dopaminergic pathway that goes to the basal ganglia, okay? And tardive dyskinesia arises when that pathway basically becomes dysfunctional. And you'll see it with patients, sometimes people going with the lip movement, etc. And that's a sign, in essence, that pathway just isn't working anymore. Okay, and that happens at about a rate with the old drugs of about 5% a year, and it's cumulative, 5% after 1 year, 10% after 2, 15% after 3. So what Chenard and Jones hypothesized, well, what's happening to the pathway to the limbic system? And the limbic system is thought to be a mediator of psychosis. And he says, well, maybe this pathway is becoming somewhat dysfunctional. And if that pathway becomes somewhat dysfunctional, maybe psychosis, in fact, is sort of become, he calls it tardive psychosis. It'll set in on almost a permanent basis. And they looked at this. They did a study of 216 schizophrenia patients who had been on meds for some time, I guess on average 10 years. And 30% showed signs of this sort of permanent psychosis, of this tardive psychosis. And they said, okay, they calculated that it happened at 3% a year, and they wrote, when this happens, the illness appears worse than ever before. New schizophrenic or original symptoms of greater severity will appear. So this worry arises in the early 1980s. And there were actually some questions. Should neuroleptics be withdrawn? This was seen as so problematic. And then for various reasons, it was shoved aside, this concern. Partly was because we got DSM-3 in 1980. And DSM-3 was very much a medical model, and we began to get this public story press that these drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain, and you could hardly be communicating this to the population and still be giving that story. So now the question is, was this a false alarm, or do we have reason to worry that maybe this does happen in some certain percentage of patients? That's number one. And is there evidence today to show that maybe some psychotic patients today could in the first episode get better without the medication? So two things we want to look at. 3 observational studies that have been done since that time. First one is by Courtney Harding. She was at BU. She followed a group of patients from released from the backwards of Vermont State Hospital in the early 1960s. She followed them up 20 years later, and she actually had good news to report. She reported that 1/3 of the patients were completely recovered. Asymptomatic, working, sort of back in line. So this was very good. It was surprising. Now, all those who were completely recovered did share one thing. They had all gone off the medication. So she concluded in the paper, she said, it is a myth that people with schizophrenia need to be on medications all their lives, and it may in fact be a small percentage who need to be on medications all their lives. So that reinforces this idea of sort of selective use. The second studies were studies done by the World Health Organization in the 1970s and 1980, and these were studies that compared outcomes in the US and 6 other rich countries with outcomes in 3 poor countries. India, Colombia, and Nigeria. They twice found that outcomes were much better in the poor countries in the world. The difference was so strong that they concluded, and I quote, that living in a developed country is a strong predictor that you will never fully recover from schizophrenia, which is quite a damning finding. And now after they did the first study, and these were 2- and 5-year studies, so they were longer term, they hypothesized, well, maybe what's going on is that patients in the poor countries are more medication compliant. They're not as resistant as people in the United States and elsewhere. So they looked at medication usage, and what they found was in the poor countries of the world, only 16% of patients were regularly maintained on drugs versus 61% in the rich countries. So there at least you saw better outcomes associated with sort of less regular use of meth.